1 Second After explores the possibility of an electromagnetic pulse destroying all of the electrical infrastructure in the United States. It doesn't just explore the day-to-day ramifications of what happens for a man in his small town and the community. It also explores what happens on a broad scale, although those concepts don't really come into play until very late in the book, and even more so when we're talking about the sequel books that are 1 year after the final day, and then most recently, 5 years after. And those books are going to have their own video because I have some thoughts about them. It kind of feels, the basic idea is I think that the franchise is starting to become a little bit drawn out, and it kind of just starts feeling like we're cashing in because we're moving into these kind of absurd apocalypse fiction directions where there's like secret governments, and then there's all this ridiculous stuff that's happening in the background that kind of, in my opinion, just pulls away from what the original book was really good at, which is showing this really grounded story of a man, his family, and his community. But essentially, when we talk about the sequel books, it doesn't really tell the same sort of story that I really enjoyed in 1 Second After. That's not to say they're necessarily bad books, and I'm going to cover them separately, but you do miss a lot of the super grounded stuff that we have here in 1 Second After. But just the book starts with all the power goes out. When it happens, it's a really dull moment in the book, kind of. It's not like oh my god, it's on, shit's going down, that you really get with I guess a more apocalyptic apocalypse, if that makes sense, where you have like a nuclear apocalypse where missiles are falling, all the cities are exploding in atomic fire, and that's something that the Fallout franchise does really well. It makes this sort of massive, this unbelievable spectacle out of the end of the world. In 1 Second After, it's more boring. You might think this is a mark against the book, but actually I think it's one of its strongest points. The book doesn't rely on this massive grand spectacle in order to keep you interested in what's going on. It's able to do that quite easily through its characters and through the drama that it creates with the situations unfolding with this electric grid down kind of scenario. It's not necessary to have bombs blowing up and people dying constantly, although, trust me, people will die in this book, but it won't be in the sort of over-the-top ridiculous way that a lot of post-apocalypse franchises end up falling into, and even the franchise itself ends up falling into in its later sequels. But again, that's a different video. I think the sort of slow apocalypse that I described really makes it feel more realistic and almost more fun in a sense, because when the power goes out, what really happened? It's like, okay, the fan starts winding down and your call goes dead. Those are all things that happen sometimes, and they're pretty mundane and boring. So as the book progresses, within like a couple of days of book time, now stuff's really starting to get bad. And I really like how this sort of slow apocalypse kind of allows the tension to really build. But one of the other cool things in this book is it explores how not necessarily all of your tech is completely destroyed. The protagonist's in-laws have a 59 at Ford Etzel and a Mustang. Those both still work because they don't have the sensitive electronics that modern cars have. The fact that Matherson has this Ford Etzel just is a really interesting device that Fortune uses here, because you start thinking about all the people that don't have a functioning car in the apocalypse now. So you have Matherson, who does have a car, and that kind of gets him in trouble in the beginning of the book. There's some people that come up to him and they're like, "Oh, how come your car's still working when everybody else's is?" And it's that's an interesting moment because social order instantly starts breaking down like minutes after the EMP went off and the power's out. And then throughout the entire book, Matherson's using the car, and it's super useful for him, for helping out his community and for himself and his family. But it really helps to put the entire just loss of power thing into perspective, because you start thinking, oh, what if Matherson didn't have this car? So it's very well done. Fortune does a really good job of making the community's response in this book feel really realistic and interesting, even though it's not necessarily somewhere you can actually see yourself living in or being in, just because it's so distant and it doesn't feel real, but it does feel grounded, like something that could actually happen. And That's a really impressive thing that he managed to do here. So we get into the community's response to all of the new issues that have arisen since the power that has gone out. And there's a serious problem because all the people that were driving anywhere near Black Mountain at the time are now stuck. They have nowhere to go and their cars no longer work. Hundreds of motorists are stranded and they need help, and the residents don't feel like they can help them. They don't have enough food, they don't have enough water for themselves, and they don't necessarily feel like being charitable when the world's ending. At least from their perspective, the world as they know it is ending, and they don't necessarily feel like they can help everyone who comes through. Like I said, Matherson has his own problems during this entire book. Food is one of the big ones. Very fast, in about the middle of the book, they start to find that pretty much all the woods are entirely hunted out. A lot of people think that those really small towns are going to have food just coming out everywhere and that they're going to be able to hunt and farm, and that's really not the case. Even small towns like that are going to have populations that are way too big to sustain themselves without outside influence from supply line deliveries. So you really are seeing that in this book. You're seeing people immediately hunt out whatever wildlife that they can possibly find. Yeah, another thing that the book goes into that I thought was really interesting was without modern sanitation and supplies, minor wounds become seriously infected and can kill you very, very quickly. The community almost immediately exhausts its supply of antibiotics obviously without modern sanitation, diseases start to surge immediately, and then social order starts to break down. When the book takes place, it's too late in the year to really plant and harvest crops on this new massive scale, and a lot of the skills of the past that existed when electricity and modern conveniences weren't so prevalent are basically non-existent. Nobody remembers how to can, or very few people are particularly adept gardeners anymore, and it's not necessarily their fault. Why would you start gardening when there's so much good food at the store that's, in a lot of instances, higher quality than whatever you would get gardening yourself? The book kind of paints a very apocalyptic view of what would happen in the event of total power outage across the continental United States. One of the things that I neglected to mention earlier is that when the power goes out, your biggest concern isn't getting food or not having any proper sanitation or even your infected wounds. Now you have prisons that have lost all their power, and all the people in those prisons, because remember, all the cell doors have electronic locks. Now they're out. They're free, and the police aren't going to do anything about it. They're running for the hills just like everybody else in the town is. And the odds are that those prisoners, once they're out, are going to take over that prison, and they're going to use it as a base of operations. And the odds are those prisoners are in the exact same boat that everybody else is in. Not only do they not have skills of their own to make things, but they're morally corrupt enough that they think that they should take it from other people. And that becomes a problem when you're in a small town like Black Mountain and you have hundreds of criminals that are coming to your town, and they're going to steal all of your stuff, and they're going to decimate your population because they're willing to do whatever it takes to survive. So a big part of the book revolves around the town organizing because the town of Black Mountain is a college town. So a big part of the book revolves around mobilizing a fighting force to defend against the group that they called the Posse. That is basically just criminals and rapists and murderers that are coming to go destroy this. They're going to pillage this entire town, ransack everything, and take whatever they want and whatever they can, and then they're going to move on to the next town and do it again. That's one of the things that a lot of people wouldn't think that would be a serious problem if the power goes out. You don't think if the power goes out that it's like, oh, I'm going to have to defend myself against criminal gangs. Your biggest concern is probably, wow, I don't have any running water or food. So I think that this would catch a lot of people. This particular part of the book is going to catch a lot of people by surprise, and it makes total sense when you're reading it. There's no part of the book where I'm like, oh wow, that's really stupid and doesn't make any sense. Towards the end of the book, they're fighting the Posse, and they have this massive battle against them, and they kill all the Posse leaders. And then John Matherson has this moment where he's like, they capture the leader of the Posse. Matherson has this moment where he's like, okay, I can't just let this guy live, because what are you supposed to do? Imprison him and then have him be a drain on the community, feeding him? Those are those are the privileges of living in a very wealthy society, where we can take horrible people who have done horrible things, and then we can keep them alive in prison cells because we can afford. It's a pretty low drain on our system to feed them because we consider it more humane than what used to be, where we would just hang them like Old West style. And John Matherson has this moment where he's thinking like, okay, this is it. Like, the world is totally different now. There's nothing else I can do. I can't keep this guy alive. If I let him go, he's just going to hurt somebody else. He's just going to steal from other people. And if I keep him alive and in prison, he's going to be a drain on the community. So no matter what, the only reasonable moral option is to kill him. And that's a really defining moment for Matherson, where he's just like, okay, this is all I can do now. The world has changed. I have to be different. And that's another one of the parts of the book where you wouldn't think that the world would change so much just losing electricity, but everything changes when we lose the thing that gives us so much wealth. And it's really powerful the way the whole thing is written, and I appreciate a lot of the complex moral decisions that Matherson has to make throughout the whole story. And then later in the book, they get into this idea of what happened on the national scene once the United States is just gone, taken off of the national stage instantly. And they also talk about who actually committed the crime of detonating a nuclear device over the continental United States. And the book never says outright what happened, but at the very end, the United States Army arrives to kind of help and just see, and it's kind of treated as like a our savior has arrived kind of moment when the army gets in, and you learn that the EMP was generated by 3 missiles, one detonated over Utah, one over Kansas, one over Ohio. All the ship was immediately sunk after the missile launch, and nobody really knows exactly who was responsible for the attacks, except for likely somebody really high up in the American government. It wasn't just the United States that was hit. The book makes a point to mention that Japan and South Korea, East Europe, and Russia were all hit by an EMP, so it's not just the United States that is in turmoil. At the very least, the United States government during the book seems to believe that it was a combination strike between Iran and North Korea that conducted the attacks, and the United States retaliates by making some very big fucking holes in the ground wherever those countries used to be, as you would expect that they would. But after a year, all the overseas military forces are recalled to aid in rebuilding everything at home, as you might expect. And another thing to know about this book is that it takes place in 2009, which is when the book was written, but it's pretty old now. A lot has changed since 2009, so I would be kind of interested to see what happens if the world gets frozen in 2009. It's interesting to see how technology has progressed and how it's in some ways become more a part of our lives than ever. I think because of that, I feel like it would be really interesting to see what would happen if this book were written today or took place in 2024, because I think the effects on people would be tremendously different just based on the way that social media has changed our lives and the way we consume information. But now I want to wrap up with a couple of closing thoughts and a couple of criticisms that I have of the book, because it's not a perfect book, believe it or not, so let's get into that. So, a couple of the thoughts that I have about this book. I didn't like everything that I read here. Mainly, the book does a little more telling than showing than it probably should. A lot of the action, maybe not a lot of the action, but a decent chunk of the action happens off screen, where they'll just jump to the end of whatever the conflict was. The central conflict of the entire book's story is with a group called the Posse, who are just escaped convicts and prisoners who have started running amok and raping and pillaging whatever towns they come across for whatever resources they could find. And one of the central conflicts of the book is the town coming together and forming a militia to fight them off. And it sort of just happens. One of the side characters, Ben, is about to go and leave, and then he says goodbye to everybody, and then they go to take him to the forward operating base or wherever they're stationing people to get them ready for the attack. And then while that's happening, while they're loading up the truck and everything, the chapter ends, and then it cuts to the very end of the battle where they're raiding the house and pushing out some of the last people who are alive that are members of the posse. It's not the most irritating thing in the world. A good chunk of the action still happens within the confines of the book and isn't just talked about. Especially, it's very apparent that the author wanted John Matherson. You see everything through John Matherson's eyes. You don't really go and look at what other people are thinking ever during the book. You don't see what other people are seeing during the entire course of the book. It's all the central protagonist. So if you have a problem or think you would get bored very quickly when talking about just one protagonist who is experiencing everything, because the only thing that matters from the book's perspective is whatever John is doing at the moment, whatever problems John is having at that exact moment. And even then, there's a scene where John gets a staph infection from a small cut, which is, to be fair, a pretty good illustration of how the world changes when we're post medicine, where there's almost no antibiotics left in the town, and normal sanitation has gone out the window. So John gets a staph infection. Even that kind of just happens, and there's not a lot of build up. There's no like, oh man, is John gonna die? It just happens, and that one I'm willing to forgive a little bit more because the purpose of it wasn't to build tension so that you like, oh, is the protagonist going to die? It was just meant to illustrate, okay, here's what can happen in a post-medicine world. So that one I'm a bit more forgiving of. But the Battle of the Posse thing is just kind of unforgivable, and that really put a damper on the ending of the book for me. It kind of felt like we were just trying to wrap this up as quickly as possible. So yeah, those are my main complaints with the book. Overall, I would give it a solid 8 out of 10. I just really enjoyed it. I love all of the tension building at the beginning of the book. The beginning and the middle of the book, there's a lot of tension. You don't really know what characters are going to make it out, and a lot of them don't make it out. A bit minor spoiler there. But all in all, it's a great book, and very few books make me very emotional. But the ending, the ultimate ending of this book, which I kind of talked about what happens at the end, but at the ultimate ending of the book, it really got me with some small spoiler here again. Some major character deaths that happen, and that was really emotionally impactful, and it was just really, really good book. It's much less apocalyptic than your average post-apocalyptic novel. There's not a lot of explosions going off. There's not a lot of people dying. But if you're a fan of a realistic, grounded story that shows what happens when the power goes out and what people will do, you're going to be very satisfied with what you read here. But yeah, an 8 out of 10. This is a very solid book. I highly recommend it to anybody who enjoys the post-apocalypse genre, or even if you don't really, this would be a great introduction to the post-apocalypse genre, just because it's not so big and so large scale, and there's nothing like that really requires you to suspend your disbelief in something like The Walking Dead or any really zombie apocalypse related movie or property or something like that. There's kind of a bit of, okay, this is a bit ridiculous, and then you have to suspend your disbelief there. But overall, 1 second after, great book, highly recommend. Outside of those several criticisms that I had there, I think it's a great book that a lot of people should very much consider reading.
Julia and Romeo, motherfucker? Dude, isn't that a book?
Okay, I am back. I didn't expect to do any more about this particular book, but I decided I was going to go to Goodreads and check and see what people were actually talking about and saying about this book. And I found myself somewhat irritated at a lot of the criticisms that people have. I don't think a lot of them make any sense, so I'm going to be going through a couple of them that I picked out here. These are pretty well liked on Goodreads. This one that I'll address first has 686 likes, so a lot of people agree with these points. Overall, the book still has a very good rating on Goodreads. Most people seem to like it, but it seems like a significant vocal minority did not enjoy the book nearly like I did, at the very least. So I just want to address a couple of things that I found here. 5 Things I Hated About 1 Second After by Timmy here. He starts off by saying, every important adult male character is either military or ex-military. As a bonus, several minor characters that are merely alluded to are also ex-military. He says this, but I don't really understand why this is a problem. Like, what's wrong with having? I mean, I feel like it just kind of makes sense that a lot of the important characters in the apocalypse would be military or ex-military. They have the military provides extremely valuable skills that would come in very handy in an apocalypse type scenario. So I don't really understand. Like, first of all, this complaint doesn't make any sense because it's not a complaint that has any sort of reasonable justification for saying that the book is bad. That it doesn't make any sense. The book contains mostly military characters, thus the book is bad, is just a nonsense point that doesn't really make any sense to me. But besides that, we'll go down to his second criticism. As the others have pointed out, the author doesn't know the difference between of and have. This is a pretty fair criticism, to be honest. Like there are several issues where like the editor didn't really do their job very well, and there's just some minor grammatical errors throughout the entire book. But honestly, this is a pretty minor editorial issue that he's bringing up here. It's not very annoying, and the first time that I read the book, I actually listened to it on audiobook, so this didn't bother me at all, and I didn't find it particularly annoying. But it's a fair criticism, but at the end of the day, it is sort of a nitpick. Like, it's really not going to affect your enjoyment of the book that much if there's a couple grammatical errors in it. So yeah, that doesn't really make any sense to me either. I've got number 3. Perhaps most of the action happens off screen, including the deaths of all but one of the major characters, rather than active scenes. Much plot advancement takes place via expository dialogue, which leads to when he goes to number 4. But I'll discuss that one separately. This is the most fair and reasonable criticism out of all of these 5. There is a good chunk of action that just doesn't happen within the book. Honestly, I didn't find that super annoying. There's a couple moments in the book where I think it really hurts it. All in all, it's not a huge deal. It's a slight annoyance at best for most of the incidences where it happens, and even where it's like really annoying, you can tell that the author is simply just trying to keep the story very focused on the protagonist and not show a lot of stuff outside of what's happening to the protagonist, which is a perfectly fine way to construct your book, even if it leaves a little bit to your you have to kind of imagine what might have happened with this, but it's not an improper way to structure a book, and there's really nothing wrong with it. So it's a fair criticism, but I think a bit overblown. Number 4, he writes, most of the scenes are meetings or speeches, usually with the main character dominating the discussion with his references to military history. Rather than showing us the hordes of refugees storming the city gates or the plague wiping hundreds out within a month, it's discussed in the past tense at a meeting of city leaders amid lengthy asides about the main character either thinking about smoking or lighting one up. Most of the important events are handled this way. Yeah, I disagree with this. It's not necessarily wrong. A lot of the really important scenes are meetings or speeches, and that is somewhat true, but there's definitely a couple of important scenes in the book that are neither of those. There's a couple of battles. There's some good action in there. There's character dialogue, which, I mean, I guess you could call that a meeting. I don't really consider it a meeting. When I hear meetings here, I'm thinking like the town council meetings, which in my opinion are one of the highlights of the book, where the town council has to decide what they're going to do with all their limited resources. Clearly, this guy didn't agree. I didn't find the meetings or speeches really or irritating or a problem at all. I thought it was generally interesting and helped to keep me engaged throughout the entire book. So I totally disagree with that. And I also disagree with the main character dominating the discussion. I feel like in the town meeting, the speeches, certainly, because, whoever's giving the speech is naturally going to dominate the discussion. But I disagree with him about the meetings here. The meetings are often have a lot of back and forth from the different characters and especially the doctor character on the town council, Doc Keller, has a lot to say and his insight's really valuable. So I don't think that's at all true, and it's not substantiated by the book at all. So I disagree with that. Yeah, number 5, almost every chapter has a character mentioned this is still America or we're still Americans. Pretty annoying, but also an excellent illustration of how every character has essentially the same voice and worldview. Yeah, this is just simply not true. This last part, every character has essentially the same voice and worldview. That's not true at all. And in the meetings that he just mentions up here in number 4, the characters disagree a lot about how they should run things, about what specifically should be done with regards to food rationing and defense and things like that. So That's not true at all. They very much disagree during the entire course of the book, and that's just absurd. So that's last point here he makes in 5 doesn't make any sense. The constant references to "this is still America" or "we're still Americans," it happens a handful of times throughout the book. I also didn't find it annoying at all. This guy found it annoying, which is, I suppose, fair. I didn't find it annoying, and I didn't think that it was really it broke my immersion or anything. I thought it was perfectly fine. But yeah, so I totally disagree. And then he makes kind of a final bonus point here. I had read that the author did years of research about EMPs, but even the technical side of the book seems sloppy and careless. He then provides no actual examples of what he means by the technical side of the book. I'll give one for him. Yeah, it's probably true that not all the cars in the entire country would just get instantly destroyed. A lot of cars would likely still run. The way I understand it, there's not a ton of testing with regards to EMPs and how they would affect cars, because it's a little bit difficult to get that test set up. Based on what we do know, this is just my understanding, is it's unlikely that all cars would just immediately go out and not work ever again. So he's right about this, but he doesn't actually say anything about any of the sloppy or careless research and depiction of EMPs that he mentions here. He gives no examples of that. Basically a few pages with a handful of EMP talking points repeated over and over. That's somewhat true. I don't feel like that's particularly out of character for what's happening in the book. John Matherson does know more than your average person about what would be going on in this situation, but he's not like an expert in EMPs or anything. That might be an interesting side that they could do of the story, where they have a leading expert in EMPs. They show what he's doing this throughout the course of the book. But yeah, I don't really understand why that's really a problem for him. And then he finishes by saying, altogether it was a frustrating read. The depth of the grimness is the only reason it didn't get 1 star, but I could change my mind and lower it. He did give it 1 star, so I guess he did go back and change his mind and lower it, I guess. I feel like 90% of this review is just nonsense that doesn't really say anything or give any actual legitimate or valid criticism. It's fine, I suppose. It's his opinion, and he read it and he didn't like it, but I would really take a lot of issue with everything that he's saying here. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I wish he would give more actual criticism of the book, but yeah, I'm going to respond to a couple more of these, and then maybe I'll wrap this up. Okay, so the second review that I'm going to be going over is from Ellis here. And she says, it's too bad this book is so poorly written, because the premise is pretty cool. The slipshod editing, you may think you're saying must have, because that's what it sometimes sounds like, but you're actually saying must have, which is the contraction for must have, I believe. And any editor with an actual job should know this. The ridiculous characters, most of all John, the hero who has it all. He's a professor, a doctor, a colonel, owns one of the only running cars left in America that the mayor apologizes for asking to borrow, has a little bit of hippie in him, and is the only person who gets to talk for more than a sentence at a time. The preposterous outcomes, say what you like about the lazy, dependent Americans, but I refuse to believe that a power outage, even on a national scale, would cause this kind of devastation in such a short amount of time. 15,000 people in one town would starve to death in less than 2 months. I'm sure there are people in the world who would love to get 1,200 calories a day. At some point, the lady character, who's there to be a sexual foil for our boy John, tells him, I feel like I'm in some bad novel. In my library copy, someone wrote an asterisk next to this at the bottom of the page, wrote, you are. Note, do not write in your library book. It's a good PSA she's put at the end. But yeah, this review also doesn't really make a ton of sense. Again, the only really fair criticism here is this first part. Yeah, the editing is not great in some places, where people will just get like contractions wrong, like must of instead of must have. Again, this specifically didn't bother me because I listened to the audiobook version first and then went back through and read it, and I just didn't really find it to be that big of a deal. It's a nitpick. It's an editorial nitpick. So if that really irritates you, then maybe stay away from this book. If you are incapable of reading anything that's grammatically incorrect, you should probably stay away with this book. She mentions that the ridiculous characters, most of all John, who is a professor, doctor, and a colonel. I don't know if she quite understands that being all 3 of those things is not, it's impressive certainly, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility. You can work towards being all 3 of these things at the same time. It's called a ROTC, or Reserve Officer Training School. You can go to college, and then you'll start working towards a degree. You'll be working towards a doctorate, obviously on a lower level, but you'll be working towards that, and you'll be working towards military rank, so being a colonel. So a lot of these can be worked down at the same time, and if you're in the Army, there's a good chance that if you go the officer route, you can get the Army to pay for more school, which will allow you to pursue a doctorate, and then later a professorship, which is what John does after he's retired. And also, it's worth mentioning that he's a retired colonel, and by the time of the book, he is a professor, but he's not super involved in everything that's going on at the school. He teaches like a class, and it's not a central part of his character. And he's a doctor in a sense. He's a doctorate in history, so it's not like he's an MD. This criticism makes no sense to me. Trying to say that John is kind of like I guess a Gary Sue type character where he could just do everything and there's nothing that he's just a perfect character, and I don't feel that way at all. And you really don't get that impression from reading the book, so I'm not 100% sure if this person actually read the book. Or at least maybe they didn't read all of it or didn't pay attention very carefully. She goes on to mention that he owns one of the only running cars left in America that the mayor apologizes for asking to borrow. Well, I mean, I feel like that's not really that stupid. It is a bit like, okay, John has a car. That's really lucky. But it's not like, oh, that's unbelievable. Unreadable book. I can't believe. I mean, what are the odds that John would have one of the only running cars left in America? And it's like, okay, it's cool. It actually serves as an interesting literary device for Forstchen to use here, which just allows John to be one of the very few characters that are in the book that has reliable and good transportation. So that's sort of a nonsense point as well. It's not a valid criticism in my opinion. I think the book would be way more boring if John didn't have a car, because we'd have a lot of walking. We'd have a lot of John walking and doing nothing, or just skipping to John going to wherever he's going, which would start to get kind of annoying. And I don't understand why she mentions that the mayor apologizes for asking to borrow. Apologizes and borrow are italicized. I think the point that she's trying to make is that the mayor should just be given the car because he's an important person. I don't really know what she's trying to say here. She mentions that he has a bit of hippie in him, and the only person who gets to talk for more than a sentence at a time, which is just very untrue. First of all, he's the protagonist, so a lot of the character dialogue has interjections that are John's thoughts, which I guess it could be annoying depending on who you are, but I like the protagonist, and I found him to be an interesting person to get to know, so I didn't really find that very irritating. It's incorrect that he's the only person who gets to talk for more than a sentence at a time. That's incorrect. But if you thought that maybe his interjections were a little bit too frequent, or they didn't add a whole lot, that would be a fair criticism, but that's obviously not what this person is talking about. And then she mentions the preposterous outcomes that happen in the book. Say what you like about lazy, dependent Americans, but I refuse to believe that a power outage, even on a national scale, would cause the kind of devastation in such a short amount of time. 15,000 people in one town really would starve to death in less than 2 months. I'm sure there are people in the world who would love to get 1,200 calories a day. I have no idea where she got the 15,000 people figure. I have scoured the entire book and I cannot find anything about 15,000 people starving to death. It could be that she took that number from the total casualties that the book lists at the very end. That's entirely possible. If that's the case, then I think she's incorrect here. 15,000 people did not starve to death. 15,000 people died. Those are very different things. Obviously, the characters in the book are dealing with a lot more than just starvation. They're dealing with disease. They're dealing with violence. They're dealing with all kinds of other problems that can get people killed when we lose all this technological infrastructure. Yeah, it's really not that unbelievable that massive chunk of the population would die in a few months. I really don't know where she gets this number from. 15,000 people starve. Even then, this isn't really that unbelievable. If there's a town of like 20 or 30,000 people, seeing half the population starve in less than 2 months doesn't seem that insane to me. I mean, your average American household keeps like a couple weeks of food on hand at best, and then maybe whatever they could scavenge from the grocery store, that's a couple more weeks. Yeah, it takes about a month to starve to death. That seems to math out from my perspective, but I don't understand what the point is there. And then she goes on, at some point the lady character, who is there to be a sexual foil for our boy John, which is, you could argue that she's a bit over-sexualized in the book. I don't really agree. The only thing that's really mentioned is that she's good-looking, and that's basically it. The book doesn't go out of its way to put her in overtly sexual situations, and it doesn't linger on anything of that nature for very long at all. So I don't really find that that's true. The bad novel comment is kind of funny, I have to admit, but obviously this is just kind of a fun anecdote that she's sharing and isn't actually indicative of the rest of her review that I've already discussed. And I feel like, based on reading this review, that she didn't actually read this very carefully. Only one thing in here actually makes sense, and that's the must of thing, where it's the contraction of must have instead of saying must of, which, yeah, that does happen a couple of times during the book that I noticed. Yeah, again, for a normal person, that's really not going to be a problem. I did pull up her Goodreads profile here, which is, this is a picture of what she looks like, so it's kind of, she kind of just looks like everybody's middle school English teacher that is just very annoying, and this is exactly what I would expect the person who wrote this review to look like, essentially. Let's just say that this is a nonsense review, and it doesn't actually deconstruct or take down anything that happened in the book at all. So, well, on to the last one. Okay, so here's the last review that I want to break down before we wrap this up. I'll read the review in its entirety, and then I'm going to pull up some excerpts from the book that basically just disprove some of his points. I'll just read the review first. This book was probably the worst book I have ever read, and my objections go far beyond the storyline, says Joe H. here. The writing style is tedious and lazy. How many times were the characters' responses to a conversation what or damn? But what I find most disturbing are, number one, the delusions of grandeur evident in the introduction and postscript. Number two, the obvious parallels between the author's real-life ego and the book's protagonist. And three, the complete lack of introspection the characters have about their actions. How many days into the blackout did the town folk suggest they should perform a summary execution for looting? 2? 7? Whatever it was, the protagonist just jumped right into the role of town executioner without the requisite inner monologue questioning the morality of the action. What would have made the story interesting is a parallel track showing how the actions of one clan affected another, or how two different clans had a different approach to solving problems. I, for one, would be interested to see the truth, that the kind of me against them thinking proselytized in the book affects moral judgment negatively and has far-reaching implications beyond the clan, but the book is completely devoid of character development, and you will not identify with any of them. As for the author's ego, I would like to point out several things. First, it is obvious that the author modeled the protagonist after himself. That, in itself, seems to be in bad taste. I'd also like to point out that the protagonist spent zero effort in the first half of the book comforting his young diabetic child. It seems to be a curious omission, given that the author dedicated the book to his daughter. Finally, I'd like to point out that the author spent a fair amount of time discussing the importance of rationing. Yet, when the protagonist's finger cut developed a staph infection, the author decided it would be best if the town doctor used a rare antibiotic to fight the staph rather than amputating the finger. The implication, I hope, is obvious, that the author is so busy settling the me against them scene that he predictably forgets that it would have been better to amputate the finger so that someone's life, rather than a finger, could have been saved instead. If you're fond of saying, but we're Americans, or shooting first and asking questions later, or believe that everyone in the world is out to get you, then this book is the book for you. If you're a conservative, you will love this book because it will feed you. Don't worry, there isn't one situation in the book that will require your introspection or make you question your beliefs. Yeah, so as you could expect, I very much disagree with this review. It's basically just full of nonsense. So this first, obviously, he didn't like the book, and that's fine. He doesn't have to like everything I like, but I don't, his criticism, I don't think are fair here. So he starts by mentioning that the writing style is tedious and lazy. The characters' responses to conversations are a bit generic, and I don't think that's necessarily untrue. Yeah, there is a bit of, I guess you could call it lazy dialogue writing in the whole thing, but it's really, as a normal reader, someone who's not coming into with a super critical point of view, you're not going to be like, oh man, these characters, they're responding in a really unrealistic manner. Yeah, the delusions of grandeur evident in the introduction and postscript, the obvious parallels between the author's real-life ego and the book's protagonist, and the complete lack of introspection the characters have about their actions. So he starts off by addressing his third point, the complete lack of introspection that the characters have about their actions. So he, as an example of the lack of introspection the characters have, he talks about how many days in the blackout did the townfolk suggest they should perform a summary execution for looting? 2, 7. So, first of all, I did reread this part of the book. It is 7. It's 1 week after the EMP hits. And it's not that they were just looting. They stole medicine from a nursing home, which is in complete and utter chaos after the EMP falls because old people need their medicine. A lot of old people are on oxygen. A lot of them have issues. They'll need life support systems, dialysis machines, things like that. So it's not like they were just looting. They stole medicine from old people. So it's a little bit different. The protagonist just jumped right into the role of town executioner without the requisite inner monologue questioning the morality of the action. Yeah, so this is just wrong. I think this is the first thing I've seen in here that is verifiably 100% incorrect. And I'm going to pull up the book, and I will give you an excerpt from the book that literally just proves everything he said completely incorrect.
I want you to do it. You're the historian, John. You understand it, the meaning of it. You're a respected professor in the town. Everyone knows you or knows your kin here. Oh, Jesus, John whispered, knowing he was trapped. Reluctantly, he nodded his head. Where? Tom asked. John couldn't think. The town park, Charlie said. It's the public gathering place. I don't want it here. Fine then, Tom replied. We take them down to the park now and do it. We load them into Jim's van. The tennis courts have a concrete practice wall. I'll go outside and announce it for 1/2 hour from now. The mention of the tennis courts chilled John. It made him think of the Taliban and the infamous soccer stadium in Kabul. Is that what we have now, tennis courts? Maybe in private, Kate ventured. Maybe in private. I don't like the thought of public execution. I don't either, John said slowly. But we have to do it. There's fear in this town. I'm hearing people say that the refugees from the highway are outsiders. We're already beginning to divide ourselves off from each other. We do private executions, and I guarantee you, within a day there'll be rumors flying from those who don't live here that we are doing Stalinist courts and executing people in the basement of the police station. If we are forced to do this, we do it in public. Besides, Tom interjected, it's a statement to anyone else who might be thinking about stealing. Wait a minute, Tom, John said. I pray we aren't down to killing people for stealing a piece of bread. Tom shook his head angrily. John, don't misread me. You might not believe this, but I don't like it any more than you. John stared into his eyes and then finally nodded. Okay, Tom. Sorry. I'll go make the announcement. Tom, Kate said, adults only? I don't want kids down there. Tom left the room, and seconds later there was the crackling hiss of an old handheld megaphone, and Tom began to speak. There was a scattering of applause, even a few cheers. Someone shouting a rope would be better. Damn, it did feel like an old Western, John thought, the crowd all but crying, "Lynch 'em." The crowd immediately broke up, many setting off for the park, some, especially those with children, staying behind. Long minutes passed, John silent, looking out the window. He heard cursing from out in the corridor and crying. The two were being led out. We better go, Charlie said, and opened the door. John felt as if he were being led to his own execution. Could he do it? All those years in the army, the training, but never a shot in anger or even in detached professionalism, as they were told they should act. During Desert Storm, he was XO of a battalion, but even there he was in a command vehicle, a couple miles behind the main line of advance, never on the actual firing line pulling the trigger.
So hopefully that helps things make a little bit more sense. Yeah, I don't have any clue what this guy is on about. There's no records in inner monologue questioning the morality of the action. This is not true. And even if you ignore the actual inner monologue that does happen in the book, the meeting right before John is walking to the execution there's no inner monologue necessary if you explain the whole thing in a meeting with the rest of the town council. So it's just a stupid point. He's not totally wrong. It would have been interesting to have a parallel track showing how the actions of one clan affect another, or how two different clans have a different approach to solving problems. I mean, that would be interesting, but it's not like necessary to make an interesting plot about this premise here. So, yeah, not really a criticism of the book either. The kind of me against them thinking proselytized in the book, yeah, this is also just not true. John repeatedly is against this whole me against them sort of mentality, and at many points he mentions how there's starting to become a divide between the people who are outside of the town, the people who are inside of the town, they're calling them the outsiders and things like that. And John is like, no, that's wrong. We don't want that happening in our community. And yeah, this just doesn't happen. There is no me against them thinking proselytized at all during this book. The book is completely devoid of character development, and you will not identify with any of them. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty opinionated. There's not really a whole lot to dissect there. If you don't identify with any of the characters, that's fine, I guess. I disagree. I found it pretty easy to identify with a lot of the characters in this book, and I thought they were mostly well written, so yeah. And he does go on to mention that the author somewhat modeled the protagonist after himself. That's not necessarily untrue. John is a bit of a self-insert, I suppose. He's the author that wanted to put the book in his hometown, so there's a bit of that. And it's not really that annoying, and it's not like the book doesn't go out of its way to make John seem like he's this holier-than-thou hero. And if you just read the book without knowing that fact, then you would have absolutely no idea that the protagonist is somewhat modeled after the author. It's really not that big of a deal. And I don't understand what he means by saying the protagonist spent zero effort in the first half of the book comforting his young diabetic child. I really don't understand what that means. What would he want? I don't know what he wants the characters to do. So that's just stupid. The author spent a fair amount of time discussing the importance of rationing, yet when the protagonist's finger developed a staph infection, the author decided that it would be best if the town doctor used a rare antibiotic to fight the staph rather than amputating the finger. The way he words this makes it sound like the author was like... The author, in his benevolence, decided that it was the best decision to use antibiotics to fight the infection instead of amputating the finger. So, firstly, I'll mention that the book specifically discusses the fact that the cut is in the crook of John's thumb and index finger, right where those connect to the hand. So the cut is all the way down the finger. So it seems likely that he would have to amputate multiple fingers, or even like a huge chunk of the hand. So it's not just, he wouldn't just be losing a finger. And also, it's not like the doctor necessarily made the correct decision, right? Like, why are we assuming that the doctor just said... I mean, it's pretty evident in the book that the doctor is like, okay, this is an old friend, so I'm going to cut him some of the rare antibiotics so that way I can save his life because I care about him and I don't want to amputate his hand or finger or whatever. So I don't... And then he sort of tries to tie this into the busy settling the me against them scene that he predictably forgets it would have been better to amputate the finger. Yeah, it's like, sure, would it have been better to amputate the finger? Yeah, it would have. But that doesn't mean that the characters in the book are necessarily going to choose the correct option. That's a nonsense point. It really doesn't deconstruct anything that's happening in the book at all. Yeah, if you're fond of saying, but we're Americans, or shooting first and asking questions later, or believe that everyone in the world is out to get you, then this is the book for you. If you're a conservative, you'll love this book because it will feed you. Don't worry, there isn't one situation in the book that will require your introspection or make you question your beliefs. I honestly have no idea what he's talking about. This last paragraph is literally just rage rambling, because I think he got mad at the book, and then he had to go to Goodreads, and he had to start writing this angry review, and it's like, he's obviously, this at the end here, this is just, the brain rot has fully taken over, and there's no coherent thoughts left in what he's saying. So yeah, this is another stupid review. So we broke down 3 really stupid reviews that don't actually make any coherent points and don't actually deconstruct any of the book's themes and don't actually make any valid criticisms, except for a handful which actually make a lot of sense, like the criticism of the editing is pretty fair, and there's a couple others. But yeah, this was stupid. I really wanted to break down some of these reviews because I thought they were stupid. The book overall has a good rating, so it's not really that big of a deal. But yeah, that's all I wanted. The book, I'm finally done covering this book because, God, this video is probably ballooned to a very long length at this point. But so, all right, goodbye.